The Riverside Correctional Facility stood like a concrete monolith amid the fields of Ohio, surrounded by triple rows of barbed wire and watchtowers. Built in 1987, it housed 2,400 inmates, most of whom were serving long sentences for serious crimes. Within those walls, there were unwritten laws, a hierarchy, and a brutal justice system. Marcus Reeves woke up at 5:30 a.m., as he had done every day for the past 7 years. At 35, he was one of the most respected inmates in Block D. His cell was located at the far end of the corridor, a privileged spot he had earned through years of impeccable behavior and the ability to keep his mouth shut. Marcus was a tall, well-built man with short dark hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see everything but reveal nothing. Serving a 15-year sentence for armed bank robbery, Marcus had long since accepted prison as his home. He worked in the prison library, which gave him certain privileges and respect among both inmates and staff. His reputation was impeccable. He never snitched, always kept his word, didn't get into fights, but didn't let anyone push him around either. Morning in Block D began with the loud sound of a siren. The inmates slowly emerged from their cells and lined up at the wash basins. Marcus watched this familiar ritual when his attention was drawn to a relatively new inmate who had arrived in their block 3 months earlier. David Collins, 31 years old, was serving a 12-year sentence for drug trafficking. He was noticeably younger and less experienced in prison life, which made him a potential target for predators. David was of average height, with blonde hair and blue eyes that had not yet lost some of their innocence. He tried to keep to himself, which in prison was both wise and dangerous. Guard Sarah Thompson began her shift at 6 a.m. At 43, she was one of the most experienced staff members at Riverside, having worked there for 15 years. Tall, with a stern face and attentive brown eyes, she had earned the respect of the inmates with her fairness and integrity. Thompson knew that in prison, every little thing could matter. Every change in an inmate's behavior could signal a problem. Breakfast in the cafeteria was the usual chaos of hundreds of voices, the clanging of metal plates, and the strict supervision of the guards. The inmates sat according to an informal but rigid hierarchy. Marcus took his usual place at the table by the window, where the most respected old-timers of the block gathered. James Wills, known to everyone as Big Jim, was the undisputed king of Block D. At 48, he was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder. A huge man with tattoos covering his arms and neck, he controlled most of the illegal trade in the prison, from cigarettes to drugs. His word was law for many inmates, and even the guards preferred not to mess with him unless absolutely necessary. "The new guy is still sitting alone," remarked one of Big Jim's associates, nodding toward David, who was eating in the corner of the dining hall. "Let him get used to it," Big Jim replied indifferently. "If he's smart, he'll figure out how things work around here. If not, that's his problem." Marcus listened silently to the conversation, occasionally glancing at David. Something about the young prisoner caught his attention, although he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Perhaps it was his vulnerability surrounded by predators, or his ability to maintain his dignity despite the circumstances. After breakfast, the prisoners dispersed to their workplaces. Marcus headed for the library, which was located on the second floor of the administration building. It was his refuge, a quiet place where he could read, help other prisoners with legal documents, and just think. The library was small but well-stocked, with several computers for legal research and reading tables. At about 9:30, David entered the library. He looked around uncertainly before approaching the desk where Marcus was working. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I'm looking for books on accounting. I want to get certified." Marcus looked up from the documents he was reviewing. David's voice was soft and educated, clearly not typical of most inmates. "Accounting," Marcus repeated, studying the young man's face. "Planning a career after you get out?" "I hope so," David replied, blushing slightly. "I mean, you have to think about something, right?" For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something resembling interest in another person. Most inmates either lived in the past or simply survived day to day. But this guy was thinking about the future. "Third row, top shelf," he said, pointing the way. "There are some good textbooks there, and computer number 2 is set up for educational programs if you need it." Thanks. David hesitated, clearly wanting to say something else. I'm David Collins. Marcus Reeves. Marcus didn't usually introduce himself to newcomers, but something made him make an exception. David nodded and headed for the indicated shelf. Marcus watched him out of the corner of his eye, noting how carefully he chose his books and how neatly he arranged them on the table. There was an intelligence in his movements that contrasted sharply with the roughness of the prison environment. Lunch break passed without incident. David was sitting alone again, but now Marcus noticed that some of the inmates were starting to pay attention to him. This was not good. In prison, loneliness made a person a target. Dr. Rita Chen held her weekly sessions in a small office next to the medical wing. An Asian-American prison psychologist, she was one of the few staff members who genuinely tried to help the inmates. Her patients included both those who voluntarily sought help and those who had been referred by the administration. "How's it going in the library, Marcus?" she asked, as he settled into the chair across from her desk. "Everything's stable," he replied, as taciturn as usual. "You mentioned a new inmate last week. Collins, I think?" Marcus tensed. He had indeed mentioned David in passing, but he didn't think Dr. Chen would remember. "He's adjusting," he said cautiously. "That's good. The first few months are always the hardest." Dr. Chen made a note in her notebook. "Are you helping him?" "I showed him where to find the accounting books." "That's nice of you. Not all inmates are so welcoming to newcomers." Marcus didn't respond, but something in her tone made him feel uncomfortable. Dr. Chen was a perceptive woman, and he didn't want her to read too much into his silence. The evening break in prison was when the true nature of the place came out most clearly. The inmates gathered in small groups, playing cards, watching TV, or just talking. But beneath the surface of this apparent normality, passions simmered, intrigues were hatched, and deals were made. Marcus usually spent this time in his cell, reading or planning the next day. But today, he noticed that David was sitting alone in the corner of the common area again, immersed in an accounting textbook. Several inmates from Big Jim's gang were shooting meaningful glances in his direction. "Problem?" Marcus asked quietly as he approached David's table. David looked up, his eyes flashing with gratitude for the company. "Not yet," he replied, "but I feel something brewing." Marcus sat down across from him, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the other inmates. "Everything is brewing in prison," he said. "The question is how you deal with it." They talked for another half hour, about books, plans for the future, life before prison. David turned out to be an intelligent conversationalist with an unexpectedly subtle sense of humor. Marcus couldn't remember the last time he'd had such an interesting conversation. When the signal sounded, the inmates headed for their cells. Marcus watched David walk down the corridor, straight and dignified, but wary. Lying on his bunk in the dark, Marcus thought about the day that had passed. Something was changing in his measured prison life, and it both disturbed and intrigued him. David Collins was not like the other prisoners. There was something special about him that awakened feelings in Marcus that he had long since buried. Behind the wall, he heard quiet sounds, someone crying, someone snoring, someone whispering to their neighbor. These were the sounds of a prison night, familiar and constant. But today, they seemed a little different to Marcus, as if the world had begun to change in subtle but irreversible ways. 2 weeks had passed since that first conversation in the library, and David had become a regular visitor. Every morning after breakfast, he would come there with his textbooks, but Marcus began to suspect that accounting was not the only reason for his visits. "Have you read The Count of Monte Cristo?" David asked one morning when the library was almost empty. Marcus looked up from the book catalog he was updating. "Dumas? Yes, a few years ago. Why?" "Just a story about a man in prison who doesn't give up. I think it's relevant." David smiled slightly, and Marcus felt a strange warmth in his chest. "Edmond Dantes spent 14 years in the Chateau d'If," Marcus said, putting down his work. "But he had a goal, revenge. What do you have?" David thought for a moment, looking out the library window at the gray walls of the prison yard. "I used to think I just wanted to survive and get out of here. But lately..." He paused. "Lately, I've been thinking that I want to be a better person. Not the person I was before I was arrested." "What were you like?" Marcus didn't usually ask personal questions, but with David it was different. Weak, David replied honestly. I didn't deal drugs because I was greedy or evil. I just couldn't find myself. I didn't know who I really was. Marcus nodded. There was a painful honesty in those words that was rare in prison. Do you know now? He asked quietly. David looked straight at him, and something deep and vulnerable flashed in his blue eyes. I'm starting to understand, he whispered. At that moment, 2 inmates from Big Jim's gang entered the library, Tommy Waxon and Ray Dennis. Both were known for their aggressiveness and unquestioning obedience to their leader. Collins, Tommy called out. The boss wants to talk to you. David paled but rose from the table with dignity. About what? He asked, trying to keep his voice from trembling. You'll see, Ray sneered. Marcus rose from his seat. It's not customary to discuss such matters in the library, he said calmly, but there was a threat in his voice. Tommy turned to him. This is none of your business, Reeves. You're smart. You should understand. I understand. Marcus took a step forward. And that's exactly why I'm saying this isn't the place for this. The tension in the air was palpable. Ray put his hand on the back of the chair, ready to use it as a weapon. But at that moment, Supervisor Thompson entered the library. Problems, gentlemen? She asked, looking appraisingly at the group. No problems, ma'am, Tommy replied quickly. We were just looking for some books. Then take your books and go, she said dryly. The librarian has work to do. After Tommy and Ray left, Warden Thompson lingered. Marcus, is everything okay? She asked. Yes, ma'am, just routine. She nodded, but her gaze was attentive. If anything changes, let me know. When they were alone, David sank into a chair as if his legs had given way. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For standing up for me. No one has ever stood up for me in prison. Marcus felt a strange tightness in his chest. The library is neutral territory, he said, but they both knew that wasn't the whole story. That evening, Marcus was lying on his bunk when he heard a soft knock on the wall. 3 short, 2 long, the code the prisoners used to communicate between cells. He responded with the same knock. A few minutes later, a note appeared under the door, passed from cell to cell. Marcus unfolded the small piece of paper and read the short message. Thanks for today, D. He stared at those simple words for a long time, feeling something inside him change irrevocably. The next day, the relationship between them changed imperceptibly. Their conversations became more personal, their glances longer. David told him about his childhood in Cleveland, about his parents who had been disappointed in him, about his friends who had turned their backs on him after his arrest. What about your family? He asked Marcus. No family, he replied briefly. My parents died when I was 20. I have no brothers or sisters. I left my wife before I went to prison. I didn't want her to wait for me. Lonely, David said quietly. I'm used to it. Marcus shrugged, but there was pain in his voice. And now? David looked at him straight in the eye, and there was something in that look that made Marcus's heart beat faster. Now what? Marcus whispered, even though he knew where this conversation was going. Are you still lonely? There was a long pause. The library was quiet, except for the sound of a guard's footsteps somewhere in the hallway. No, Marcus finally replied. Not anymore. That was the moment when everything changed. They didn't touch each other or say words of love, but they both understood that something deep and dangerous had developed between them. Big Jim didn't give up trying to talk to David. He sent his men at different times, to the shower, the courtyard, the dining hall. But every time something got in the way, a guard appeared, or David wasn't alone, or some distraction arose. The guy's lucky, Tommy remarked one evening. His luck will run out, Big Jim replied grimly, and someone's helping him. We have to find out who. Marcus felt the pressure mounting. He knew it was getting harder to protect David, but he couldn't stop. For the first time in 7 years in prison, he felt alive. Their relationship developed slowly and cautiously. Casual touches of the hands as they passed books to each other. Long glances across the dining hall. Notes passed through the prison's complex mail system. One evening, when most of the inmates were watching TV in the common area, they found themselves alone in a far corner of the library. David was upset about a letter from his brother, who wrote that his family no longer wanted anything to do with him. "They're right," he said, wiping his eyes. "I disgraced them. I ruined everything I touched." Marcus couldn't keep his distance any longer. He walked over to David and gently put his hand on his shoulder. "You're not the person you used to be," he said quietly. "People change." David looked up at him, his eyes full of pain and gratitude. "How do you know?" "Because you changed me," Marcus whispered. At that moment, the tension between them was so intense that the air seemed to crackle with electricity. David slowly rose from his chair, and they were now very close to each other. "Marcus," David whispered, and there was so much anguish in his voice that the older man's heart ached. Marcus raised his hand and gently touched David's face. The skin was warm and soft, completely unlike the harshness of the prison world around them. "This is dangerous," he said, but did not remove his hand. "I know," David replied, closing his eyes against the touch. "But I can't pretend anymore." They stood there for a few seconds, on the verge of a kiss, on the verge of a confession, on the verge of something that could destroy them both. But the sound of footsteps in the hallway made them jump away from each other. A young prisoner entered the library asking for help with some legal documents. Marcus and David returned to their business, but the atmosphere between them had changed forever. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He realized he was falling in love, and it scared him more than any threat in prison. Love made a person weak and vulnerable, and in a place like Riverside, weakness could cost you your life. But when he closed his eyes, he saw David's face, his blue eyes full of trust and tenderness, and he knew it was too late to back out. Dr. Rita Chen noticed changes in Marcus's behavior before he even realized them himself. "You look different," she said during their weekly session. "In what way?" Marcus asked cautiously. "Less tense, almost happy," she wrote in her notebook. "That's good. What's changed?" Marcus hesitated. Dr. Chen was the only person in prison he trusted, but even she couldn't tell the whole truth. "Just found a new interest, helping an inmate with his education." "Collins?" She raised an eyebrow. Marcus nodded, trying to look indifferent. "That's noble of you. But be careful, Marcus. In prison, any relationship can be misinterpreted." Her words sounded like a warning, and Marcus realized that his secret with David might not be so secret after all. Meanwhile, Big Jim was losing patience. His authority was beginning to suffer from the fact that some newcomer had been avoiding the talk for several weeks. "Enough of this cat-and-mouse game," he said to Tommy and Ray. "Find a way to get him alone. I don't care how." "What if Reeves interferes?" asked Tommy. Big Jim smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Then we'll have two conversations instead of one." The end of the chapter found Marcus and David finally realizing that their feelings were mutual, but also realizing the danger of their situation. Prison did not forgive weakness, and love in this place was the most dangerous weakness of all. The morning began as usual, but there was tension in the air. Marcus noticed it as soon as he left his cell. Too many glances, too much whispering that stopped when he appeared. In 7 years at Riverside, he had learned to sense the mood of the prison as if it were a living organism, and right now that organism was agitated. In the dining hall, he sat down at his usual table, but noticed that David was nowhere to be seen. This was strange. The young man never missed breakfast, saying it helped him structure his day. "Your friend not hungry?" Marcus's cellmate, Jerry Malone, asked with a smirk. "What are you talking about?" Marcus tried to keep his tone indifferent. "The young hunk, Collins. I heard he's sick." Jerry chewed a piece of toast and added, "Or someone helped him get sick." Marcus stood up so abruptly that his chair fell over. The sound attracted the attention of the entire dining room, including the guards. "Where is he?" Marcus asked quietly but menacingly. "Medical," Jerry replied, clearly enjoying the reaction. "They say he slipped in the shower. An accident." Marcus knew there were no accidents in prison, especially in the showers, especially with newbies who someone didn't like. He headed for the dining hall exit, but his path was blocked by Guard Johnson, a young, ambitious officer who liked to show off his authority. "Where are you rushing off to, Reeves?" "To the library, to work," Marcus replied, trying to control his voice. "The workday hasn't started yet. Sit down and finish your breakfast. Johnson said, putting his hand on his baton. That's an order. Marcus slowly returned to the table, but he couldn't eat. Every minute dragged on like an hour until finally the bell rang to signal the start of the workday. Instead of the library, he headed for the infirmary. The way there was through the main corridor, where guard Thompson was on duty. Marcus, she called out to him, you're not at your workstation. I want to check on my sick cellmate, he said. Sarah Thompson looked at him closely. In her 15 years working in the prison, she had learned to read people, and now she saw something in Marcus's eyes that alarmed her. Collins? She asked. Marcus nodded. He's fine. A few bruises, maybe a concussion. Dr. Harris is examining him. She paused. Marcus, if you know anything about what happened. I don't know anything, he interrupted. Can I see him? 5 minutes, she agreed after a pause, but then go back to work. The Riverside Medical Ward was a small room with 4 beds separated by curtains. David was lying on the last bed, his face pale and a large bruise under his left eye. Hi, Marcus said quietly as he approached the bed. David opened his eyes and smiled weakly. Not as bad as it looks. What happened? David looked around to make sure they were alone. Tommy and Ray, they waited for me in the shower. They said Big Jim wouldn't wait any longer. Marcus clenched his fists. What else did they say? That if I don't talk to the boss tonight, next time will be worse. And David fell silent. And what? And they know, David whispered. About us. Tommy said the boss has special plans for prison lovers. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. If Big Jim knew about their relationship, they were both in mortal danger. Homophobia was one of the strongest traits of the prison leader. How did they find out? He asked. I don't know. Maybe someone saw us in the library or the notes. David tried to sit up, but couldn't. Marcus, I don't want you to get hurt because of me. Shut up, Marcus said sharply, but there was tenderness in his voice. We'll figure it out. At that moment, Dr. Harris, an elderly man who had been working in prison medicine for 20 years, entered the infirmary. Time's up, he said to Marcus. The patient needs rest. Marcus nodded and headed for the door, but David called after him. Marcus, their eyes met. Be careful. The rest of the day passed in a fog of anxiety and planning. Marcus tried to work in the library, but his thoughts kept returning to David and the threat of Big Jim. He knew the prison hierarchy better than anyone else in Block D, and understood that a direct confrontation with the gang leader would be suicide. But the idea of losing David was even worse. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dr. Rita Chen walked into the library. She didn't usually visit this place without an appointment. Marcus, do you have a minute? She asked. He nodded and walked over to her desk in the far corner. I heard about the incident with Mr. Collins, she began. How are you feeling? Fine, he replied automatically. Really? Because Supervisor Thompson said you seemed very upset. Marcus realized he was trapped. Dr. Chen was too perceptive. I don't like it when newcomers are attacked, he said cautiously. That's commendable, but I feel there's more to it than that. She leaned forward. Marcus, if you have a special relationship with Mr. Collins, you need to understand the risks. Marcus's heart began to race. I don't understand what you're talking about. I think you do. Her voice was soft but insistent. In prison, people sometimes find comfort in each other. It's natural, but it's also extremely dangerous. Marcus was silent, but his face probably gave him away. I'm not going to turn you in, Dr. Chen continued, but others have already noticed, and some of them aren't as understanding as I am. What do you suggest? Marcus finally asked. Be careful, much more careful, and consider taking a break from your relationship, at least until the situation calms down. After she left, Marcus sat alone for a long time, thinking about her words. She was right, they had to be careful. But the thought of distancing himself from David was painful. That evening, during dinner, David returned from the infirmary. The bruise under his eye had darkened, but he stood straight and dignified. Marcus watched as he picked up his tray and looked around for a place to sit. Their eyes met across the crowded dining hall. David nodded toward an empty table in the corner, and Marcus knew he wanted to talk. But before Marcus could get up, Tommy and Ray approached David's table. "Time to talk to the boss," Tommy said loudly, so that half the dining room could hear. David slowly stood up. "Okay, let's talk." Marcus also stood up, but Ray held up his hand. Just him. The boss was clear. "It's okay," David said, looking at Marcus. There was determination in his eyes, but also fear. Marcus watched as they led David out of the dining hall, feeling completely powerless. Around him, the other inmates continued to eat and talk, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone knew that something important was happening. Half an hour later, David hadn't returned. An hour later, neither had he. Marcus couldn't sit still any longer. He knew where Big Jim held his talks, in an old storage room next to the laundry room, where the surveillance cameras hadn't worked for several years. It was the perfect place to educate someone without witnesses. The corridor leading to the storage room was poorly lit. Marcus walked cautiously, listening for sounds. First, he heard Big Jim's voice, low and threatening. "You think I'm stupid, Collins? You think I don't know what you're doing to Reeves?" "I don't know what you're talking about," David replied, but his voice betrayed his tension. "Don't lie to me." There was a thud. "I know everything. Your games in the library, the notes, the tender glances. You make me sick, you faggots." Another blow, and David groaned in pain. "You know what we do to people like you?" Big Jim continued. "We teach them to be real men, or you both disappear, forever." Marcus couldn't listen anymore. He pushed open the pantry door. There were 4 of them inside: Big Jim, Tommy, Ray, and David. The young man was sitting on a chair, his lip was split, and his shirt was torn. Big Jim was standing over him with his fist raised. "Let him go," Marcus said quietly. Everyone turned to him. Big Jim slowly lowered his hand. "Here comes the other lover," he sneered. "How sweet. Come to rescue your princess?" "I said let him go," Marcus repeated, taking a step forward. "Or what?" Big Jim also approached. He was bigger than Marcus and had a reputation as a vicious fighter. "Or I'll tell the administration about your drug business," Marcus bluffed. But he sounded confident. Big Jim's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me." The tension in the small storage room was palpable. Tommy and Ray waited for their boss's orders, ready to fight. David tried to get up from his chair. "Marcus, get out of here," he whispered. "This isn't your war." "Shut up," Marcus said, keeping his eyes on Big Jim. "You know what, Reeves?" the gang leader said slowly. "You're right. It's not worth the trouble. See you." He signaled to his men, and they headed for the exit. But at the door, Big Jim turned around. "This isn't over," he said. "This is just the beginning. And when I'm done with you, there won't be anything left of your love games." After they left, Marcus rushed over to David and helped him to his feet. "Are you okay?" he asked, examining the damage. "I'll survive." David tried to smile, but winced in pain. "Thanks. Again." "You're welcome," Marcus said, putting his arm around David's shoulders to support him. "We need to get out of here." They walked slowly down the hallway when David suddenly stopped. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I can't do this anymore. The threats, the danger. Maybe we should stop, before someone gets hurt for good." Marcus turned to him. In the dim light of the hallway, David's face looked haggard and exhausted. "Is that what you want?" he asked. David closed his eyes. "No, but I don't want you to die because of me. And I don't want to live without you," Marcus said with such passion that he surprised himself. David opened his eyes, and tears glistened in them. "Then what do we do?" "I don't know," Marcus replied honestly. "But we'll figure something out. Together." They stood in the empty hallway, surrounded by gray walls and bars. But at that moment, nothing mattered but the two of them. Marcus gently touched David's face, tracing the bruise under his eye with his finger. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" "For getting you into this, for not being able to protect you properly." David covered his hand with his own. "You're already doing more than anyone has ever done for me." At that moment, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly pulling away from each other, they headed for their cells, knowing that tomorrow would bring new dangers, but also knowing that they would face them together. None of them slept that night. Each lay on his bunk, thinking about the other, about what lay ahead, and about the price of love in a place where love was considered a deadly sin. The next 3 days passed in tense anticipation. Big Jim seemed to have disappeared. He didn't show up in the dining hall or hold his usual meetings in the common area. The silence was worse than any open threat. Marcus knew prison psychology well enough to understand that when a predator was lying low, he was preparing for the decisive blow. David tried to act normal, but the bruises on his face betrayed his state of mind. He still came to the library, but their conversations became cautious, full of half-spoken words. Too many eyes were watching them. Guard Thompson increased the number of rounds in Block D. Marcus noticed her lingering outside their cells, listening to the inmates' conversations. He knew the administration suspected something, but they couldn't prove anything yet. On Thursday morning, everything changed. Marcus woke up to a strange silence in the block. Usually by 6 in the morning, the corridors were already filled with sounds, coughing, talking, the creaking of beds. But today there was a deathly silence, as if the entire prison was holding its breath. He got up from his bunk and looked out the cell window. The corridor was empty, which was strange. Usually the guard on duty was already making his morning rounds. The clock on the wall showed 6:15. Suddenly the silence was broken by the sound of cells opening, but not the usual electronic signal, but the grinding of metal. Someone was unlocking the locks by hand. Marcus quickly got dressed and stood by the door, listening. He heard quiet footsteps and muffled voices. Then his own door slowly opened. Tommy stood in the doorway with a set of lockpicks in his hands. Behind him were the silhouettes of Ray and 2 other prisoners from Big Jim's gang. "Time to go," Tommy said quietly. "Where?" Marcus assessed his chances, 4 against 1 in a narrow corridor. "The boss wants to finish the conversation, and you'll be there too." They led him out of the cell and down the corridor. Marcus noticed that David's cell door was also open. The young man walked ahead, surrounded by 2 of Big Jim's guards. His hands were tied behind his back. "Where are the guards?" Marcus asked. "Shift change," Ray smirked. "The boss has friends among the staff. They made sure we have privacy." They descended the service staircase to the basement of the prison, where the old solitary confinement cells, unused for several years, were located. The air here was musty and cold, and the only light came from a few bulbs on the ceiling. Big Jim was waiting for them in one of the cells. The room was empty, except for an old cot in the corner and a rusty sink. On the cot lay homemade knives, sharpened pieces of metal wrapped in rags for a better grip. "Welcome to court," Big Jim said when everyone was brought into the cell. Marcus and David were placed side by side, facing the gang leader. The others took up positions at the entrance and in the corners of the cell. "You know why you're here," Big Jim began, pacing slowly in front of them. "There are rules in this prison. There is order, and there are things we don't tolerate." He stopped right in front of David. "Faggots are one of those things." David raised his head, his eyes determined despite his fear. "We didn't do anything," he said firmly. Big Jim laughed, the sound echoing off the cell walls. "You didn't do anything? My people saw you. Notes, meetings, affection in the library." He turned to Marcus. "And you, Reeves, you disappoint me the most. I respected you for 7 years. I thought you were a real man." "I'm the same person I've always been," Marcus replied calmly. "No, you've become weak. You let this boy turn you into a woman." The tension in the cell was palpable. Marcus could feel every muscle in his body preparing for a fight. "What do you want?" he asked. Big Jim picked up one of the knives from the bunk, testing the sharpness of the blade with his finger. "Justice," he said. "One of you has to die, to set an example for the rest." David turned pale but didn't back down. "Kill me," he said. "Leave Marcus alone." "No!" Marcus cried out sharply. "You'll kill me!" Big Jim grinned. "How touching! But I've got something better." He threw the knife on the floor between Marcus and David. "One of you will kill the other. The survivor will receive my forgiveness and protection. The one who refuses will die a painful death, and his lover will follow him." A deathly silence fell. Even breathing seemed too loud in that stone box. "You're crazy," David whispered. "Maybe," Big Jim agreed, "but it's the only way. You have 1 minute to think about it." Marcus stared at the knife lying between them. The homemade weapon was crude but deadly effective. One blow in the right place would be enough. "Marcus," David said quietly, "take it." "What?" "Take the knife. Kill me." Marcus turned to him, his eyes filled with pain and despair. "Never. You have to. You have a chance to live. I won't let you die because of me. And I won't let you die at all." Big Jim clapped his hands. "Time's up. If no one takes the knife, we'll start with more creative methods." He nodded to Tommy, who took a razor from his pocket. At that moment, something changed in the atmosphere of the cell. Marcus felt it before the others. A barely perceptible movement of air, the sound of footsteps in the corridor. "Boss," one of the guards warned quietly, "someone's coming." Big Jim frowned. "Impossible, the shift doesn't start for another half hour." The sounds grew closer. Voices, the clank of keys. "Fuck!" Ray cursed. "It's the guards." Panic broke out. The prisoners rushed around the cell, trying to hide the knives and come up with an explanation for what was happening. "Everyone shut up!" Big Jim growled. "Say we were having a meeting, discussing work issues." But it was too late. The voice of Guard Thompson rang out in the corridor. "Everyone on the floor! Hands behind your heads!" 4 guards in full gear burst into the cell. Big Jim and his men lay down on the floor, knowing that resistance would only make their situation worse. "Marcus! David!" Thompson shouted. "Are you okay?" But when the dust settled and all the prisoners were let out of the cell, it became clear that something had gone wrong. In the confusion of the raid, someone had managed to grab a knife. Guard Thompson quickly searched all the detainees. Big Jim was arrested for organizing an illegal gathering and possession of weapons. His accomplices received disciplinary penalties. "How did you find out?" Marcus asked when he and David were taken to a safe place. "An anonymous tip," Thompson replied. "Someone reported Big Jim's plans." The rest of the day was spent in interrogations and paperwork. Marcus and David were placed in temporary isolation cells for their own safety. This meant solitary confinement for an indefinite period. Marcus lay on the narrow cot in his new cell, thinking about what had happened. They had survived, but at what cost? Their relationship was no longer a secret. The entire prison knew about them, and that made them a target for any inmate looking to make a name for himself. Around midnight, he heard a soft knock on the wall, a signal from David in the next cell. Marcus responded, and they began to communicate in a code they had learned over weeks of talking. "Are you okay?" David tapped. "Yes. Are you?" "Scared, but alive." Pause. "What now?" David asked. Marcus thought long and hard about his answer. Their world had changed forever. Big Jim had been temporarily neutralized, but there were always those in prison who wanted to take the place of a fallen leader, and their relationship was now known to everyone. "I don't know," he finally replied. "But we're in this together. Always. Always." But even as he tapped out the words, Marcus felt that something had changed between them. The fear they had experienced, the stressful situation with the threat of death, all of it had left scars not only on their bodies, but also on their souls. The next day, they were transferred back to the general block, but to different sections. The administration decided that separation would be the best solution to maintain order. Marcus only saw David during mealtimes, and even then only from a distance. The young man seemed depressed and withdrawn. He avoided eye contact and sat alone. A week after the incident, Dr. Chen requested individual interviews with both men. "How are you feeling?" she asked Marcus. "Fine," was the standard response. "That's impossible after such stress. You experienced a threat to your life." Marcus remained silent. "Has your relationship with Mr. Collins changed?" she continued. "We don't have a relationship," he said automatically. "Marcus, lying won't help you or him. I can see how much you're both suffering." "Then what do you suggest?" Dr. Chen sighed. "To be honest, I don't know. The system isn't designed for situations like this." After that conversation, Marcus felt even more confused. He loved David, but their love had become a source of danger for both of them. That evening, something happened that changed everything. Marcus received a note from David through the prison's complicated mail system. The message was short. "Meet me in the old library after lights out. We need to talk." The old library was a room on the second floor that was used to store outdated books. Guards rarely went there after the end of the workday. Marcus got there around midnight, avoiding patrols and surveillance cameras. David was already waiting for him among the dusty shelves. "You came," he said quietly. "Of course I came." They stood in the semi-darkness, lit only by the light from a street lamp outside the window. David looked exhausted and thin. "We can't go on like this," he said. "I know. They've separated us. They watch our every move. And the other prisoners." David fell silent. "What about the other prisoners?" "They say things. They threaten us. They laugh behind our backs." Marcus clenched his fists. "Who? Give me names." "It doesn't matter. What matters is that we've become outcasts, and it's only going to get worse." Marcus moved closer to him. "I don't care what they say." "I do care," David snapped. "I can't live like this. In constant fear, in shame, in hiding." "Then what do you suggest?" David took something out of his pocket. In the dim light, Marcus saw a homemade knife, one of the ones that had been in Big Jim's cell. "One of us has to disappear," David whispered. Marcus took a step back. "What are you talking about?" "I stole it during the raid, while everyone was distracted." David turned the knife in his hands. "If one of us dies, the other will be free. No more threats, no more suspicion." "You're crazy!" "Maybe, but I don't see any other way out." Tension hung in the air. Marcus stared at the knife in David's hands, trying to gauge how serious he was. "Give it to me," he said quietly. "No. David, give me the knife." "You don't understand." David's voice broke. "I ruined your life. You were a respected man, and now you're an outcast because of me. It's not your fault. It is. It's all mine." David gripped the knife tighter. "And I have to fix it." Marcus took a step forward. "Don't do anything stupid." "Or what? Are you going to stop me?" A struggle ensued between them. Marcus tried to grab the knife. David resisted. They fought silently, knowing that any sound could attract the guards. In the confusion of the struggle, something went wrong. There was a muffled cry, the sound of a body falling. When everything went quiet, a dead silence reigned in the old library. In the morning, one of the prisoners' cells was found empty. A search began immediately, but the body was not found until several hours later in the old library. The prisoner lay among scattered books, a homemade knife sticking out of his chest. Blood soaked the floor around the body. Guard Thompson was one of the first on the scene. She looked at the corpse, feeling a heaviness in her chest. She knew it was inevitable, but that didn't make the loss any less painful. "Did anyone see anyone near the library last night?" she asked her subordinates. "We're checking," replied one of the officers. "But you know how it is. Nobody sees anything in prison." The prison was plunged into mournful silence. The murder shook everyone, from the inmates to the administration. Interrogations, checks, and investigations began. But the main question remained unanswered. Who killed and who was killed? Riverside Prison was a hive of activity. Detectives from the county police arrived 2 hours after the body was discovered, cordoning off the crime scene with yellow tape. The old library became the center of the most serious investigation in the institution's history. Guard Sarah Thompson stood in the hallway, watching the forensic team at work. In her 20 years on the job, she had seen a lot: fights, assaults, even a few suicides. But this murder was different. Too personal, too painful. "Ma'am," Detective Rodriguez, who was leading the case, addressed her. "We need to talk about the victim and possible suspects." They went into the warden's office, where Thompson laid out the files on the desk. "David Collins, 31 years old," she began. "Served 12 years for drug trafficking. 8 months in prison. Quiet, educated, no problems." The detective studied the crime scene photos. "The wound is precise, professional. The killer knew what he was doing." "A lot of people in prison know how to handle a knife," Thompson remarked grimly. "Did Collins have any enemies? Any conflicts?" Thompson hesitated. She knew about the rumors, about Big Jim, about his special relationship with Marcus Reeves. but to say it out loud would be to destroy what was left of the dead man's reputation. "There were complications," she finally said. Collins and another inmate, Marcus Reeves, were believed to have a close relationship. This caused conflict with prison gangs. "Where is Reeves now?" "In solitary confinement. After the incident with Big Jim, we isolated them both." The detective made a note in his notebook. "We need to talk to him." Marcus was brought into the interrogation room an hour later. He looked haggard, his face strangely vacant. Detective Rodriguez turned on the tape recorder. "Mr. Reeves, where were you last night between midnight and 2 o'clock?" "In my cell," Marcus replied monotonously. "Any witnesses?" "The guard made his rounds at 1 o'clock." "Did you know David Collins?" Marcus looked up. Pain flashed in his eyes, quickly hidden by indifference. "Yes." "What was your relationship?" Pause. Marcus stared at the wall behind the detective. "We talked in the library. I helped him with his books." "That's all?" "That's all." The detective studied his face, trying to find signs of deception. "Mr. Reeves, we have information about a closer relationship between you two. Witnesses say—" "Witnesses say a lot of things," Marcus interrupted. "Gossip is entertainment in prison." The interrogation lasted 2 hours, but the detective got nothing concrete. Marcus answered briefly without showing any emotion, denying any romantic relationship with the victim. When he was taken back to his cell, the detective turned to Thompson. "He's lying, but it's hard to prove." "Maybe he's just protecting Collins' memory," the guard suggested. The investigation was gaining momentum. The detectives questioned dozens of inmates, but ran into a typical prison problem. No one saw anything, heard anything, knew anything. The code of silence worked flawlessly. Big Jim, who was in solitary confinement, was ruled out as a suspect. His alibi was ironclad, but his men remained under suspicion. Dr. Rita Chen requested permission to conduct a psychological evaluation of Marcus. The meeting took place on the 3rd day after the murder. "How are you coping with your loss?" she asked gently. Marcus sat motionless, staring out the window. "What loss?" "David's death. I know you were close." "We weren't close." Marcus, denial is a normal reaction to grief, but it won't help you heal. For the first time in 3 days, Marcus looked at her. "You think I killed him? I think you're suffering, and I want to help." Marcus was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "He wanted to kill himself. He said he had ruined my life, that one of us had to go." Dr. Chen tensed. "He threatened to kill himself?" "He didn't threaten, he planned it." "And what happened in the library?" Marcus closed his eyes. "We met to talk. He brought a knife. He said it was over, that he couldn't live in fear anymore." "And?" "I tried to take the knife away from him. We fought." Marcus's voice trembled. "I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted to stop him." Tears began to roll down his face, the first emotion he had shown in 3 days. "The knife slipped. David fell. I tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late." Dr. Chen took notes, her face professional and sympathetic. "Why didn't you call for help?" "He was already dead, and I was in shock. I just left." "It was self-defense, Marcus. You were trying to save his life." "It doesn't matter." Marcus wiped his eyes. "He's dead, and it's my fault." After that conversation, Dr. Chen immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez. Marcus's testimony radically changed the course of the investigation. The next day, a second interrogation took place. Marcus repeated his story to the detectives, giving more detailed testimony about the events of that night. "So, according to you, it was an accident while trying to prevent a suicide?" Detective Rodriguez clarified. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell the truth right away?" Marcus looked up. "Because I knew no one would believe me. 2 gay men in prison, one dead, the other with a knife. Everyone would immediately think it was jealousy, a lover's quarrel." "And that's not what happened?" "No," Marcus replied firmly. "I loved him, and that's why I tried to save him." The forensic examination confirmed Marcus's testimony. The fingerprints on the knife belonged to both men. The wounds were consistent with a struggle, and the angle of the blade's entry indicated that the wound was accidental. A week later, the district attorney decided not to press murder charges. David Collins's death was officially ruled an accident while attempting to prevent suicide. But for Marcus, this decision meant little. He had lost the only person he loved and blamed only himself. The prison slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Big Jim was transferred to another facility after additional charges of organizing illegal gatherings. His gang fell apart without a leader. Marcus was transferred to another block for his own safety. His new cellmates didn't know his story and treated him like any other inmate. But he had changed. He became silent and withdrawn. He no longer worked in the library. Too many memories. He was transferred to the prison workshop where he silently repaired furniture day after day. Dr. Chen continued her weekly sessions, trying to help him cope with his grief and guilt. "You saved him from a painful death," she said. "David wanted to die. You gave him a quick, painless death." "I killed him," Marcus replied. "It doesn't matter what you call it." "It was a tragedy, but not a crime." Marcus shook his head. "That doesn't matter to me." A year passed. Marcus received a letter from David's brother, the first and only one. It was short and dry, saying that the family had forgiven Marcus and did not blame him for their son's death. "David wrote about you in his last letters," it said at the end. "He was happy for the first time in many years. Thank you for giving him that." Those words made Marcus cry for the first time since the tragedy. Guard Thompson retired 2 years after the incident. On her last day of work, she stopped by to say goodbye to Marcus. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm surviving," he replied. "That's good." She paused. "You know, Marcus, in all my years on the job, I've seen a lot of tragedy, but yours is special." "Why?" "Because there was real love, and in a place like this, love is rare." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "David wouldn't want you to destroy yourself," she added. "Live for him. Live for both of you." After she left, Marcus sat in his cell for a long time, thinking about her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe the best way to honor David's memory was to find a way to go on living. The prison continued to exist. New prisoners arrived. Old ones were released or died. The story of Marcus and David became a legend, whispered in the cells. Some spoke of a doomed love, others of the tragedy of the system, but they all agreed on one thing. Their story was a reminder that even in the darkest places, the human heart continues to seek love and connection. Marcus continued to serve his sentence, carrying in his heart the memory of the blue-eyed young man who had taught him to love, and who had died in his arms on a cold night in a dusty library. Every night, as he fell asleep, he heard David's voice telling him, "Be careful." And every morning, he woke up ready to live another day, not for himself, but for the memory of the man he would never see again.